So, Chase, we're talking about emotionalism in the church. Why don't you have any?
Yeah, right. Welcome back to another episode of Just Say It. We are recording in our new podcast studio.
Look at this.
It's wonderful. We are in our building in the basement in the bunker.
Yes.
There were lots of ideas for this room. Over here we still have a cavernous under the stairs area that was very creepy when we first
Very
moved in.
Harry Potter.
Yes. Well, I've never read Harry Potter.
I haven't read it either. I watched the movies.
My son has read it, which I think would make my upbringing very sad. I wasn't allowed to listen to Harry Potter.
You didn't trick or treat, did you?
Did not trick or treat.
Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah, very sad. Well, today on the episode, it's good to be with you back again. We haven't recorded one in a while because we've been trying to get in this building, so we're really thankful.
Yeah.
As we're in the building, if you're a partner of The Well, if you're a member of The Well, or just a fan from afar, we'd love your partnership at The Well. We are getting that final invoice dialed in for all the construction overages with asbestos and framing and drywall and city energy codes and all that. So I just want to make sure to put a plug here at the top. You can go to boulderwell.org/give to support the ministry of The Well Church. But today on the episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that comes up often. It's one I've thought deeply about. Matt has as well. And it's kind of evangelical spirituality. That seems like a broad topic. That seems like something that, give me some handles there. What are we talking about specifically? So specifically, what we're talking about is the experience of a Christian emotionally with Christ, even more specifically, how they relate to God in Sunday morning worship.
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big topic because when people come to a church, they have certain expectations and certain things. And I would say something, particularly in American history, if you go back and you look at, the first and second Great Awakening and you go even back further, actually kind of the revivalist mentality of our culture and how that was ingrained even from the very beginning is actually something that's very big. And I don't think people are very aware oftentimes when they think about this of what are my expectations for worship emotionally when I walk through the doors on a Sunday morning. What am I expecting? Because there's expectations, whether you know it or not, from you always hear the thing like somebody's decided whether they're coming back to your church within the first half a second of
I think it's 7 seconds or something.
Which I'm like, that's silly. And if that person wants to bounce,
Sure.
I'm like, okay, but but there is a thing where people come in if they do make it past 7 seconds, where they come in and they have expectations around what's the music like,
right?
How did it make me feel?
Exactly.
Which we were speaking about emotions. The sermon. How did it make me feel? People will say things like, I was on the verge of tears or crying. And I don't think today we're trying to get at this thing that like being emotional is bad. But I would say we are trying to kind of dive into the topic of emotionalism, which is different than just emotions, and our expectations for Sunday worship and the gathering. And what does it mean when I come to the table, when I say a creed or the Lord's Prayer? What should I be feeling? That's kind of a question that I see a lot of Christians, particularly in our context, asking.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty pervasive in American spirituality, American evangelical spirituality, for Christians to really take a lot of stock in how they feel day to day or throughout their Christian life, whether it's finding a spouse or what they want to eat or where they go to church. It's what do you feel like? And so this is a big topic because we're not without biblical precedent for this. David was incredibly transparent with how he felt, what he desired, these kind of matters. And we also have historical precedent. And just to give an example, when I was on sabbatical, I went to a few different churches to visit just to see what was going on, see what they were like. And so out where I live, there's a Greek Orthodox church nearby. And in that tradition, which we won't get into the Trinitarian issues with that tradition, but in that tradition, when you show up,
podcast.
There's not a heavy emphasis on did the new person coming to church have a particular experience that's emotional such that they feel flooded with emotions. And here, let me give one more example. So my concern is that a lot of Christians have latched they've placed their trust in Jesus, not on their faith and not on Jesus Christ and his commitment to us, but instead on the emotional reaction, so that when they go to a concert and get the same type of feeling when they cry or they're overwhelmed with emotion, that is disorienting. They don't know what to do with that, because now the same emotion I felt on Sunday morning, I feel at this concert of maybe a secular singer or whatever it may be. And now, how am I to explain that? How am I to reason about that? So I think that's where maybe a good example that other people could relate to is like that kind of experience.
Yeah, I mean, I've had that experience. I had it this year. We went to a Tyler Childers concert, and everybody at the well knows I love my Kentucky roots, and hearing him sing about Eastern Kentucky moved me, right? And so that can be a confusing thing for people. I fully understand that. I think it's helpful for people to differentiate emotion from emotionalism. Like emotion, like what we see, David, I wrote down here, Psalm 104, enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise, give thanks to him, bless his name. And it's all with exclamation marks, right? It's this exuberant kind of thing. And so I would never want people to think that scripturally that we're saying that having emotions is a bad thing. No, not at all. Or even at times to cry in church or to have a response that surprises you. I don't think we would ever say that. But I think with emotionalism, the thing is like emotionalism can kind of become our barometer, if you will, for what is true.
Yeah.
And that's a problem.
Yeah.
When our affections, our emotions are guiding what is true. A really simple example of that would be we can't allow our emotions to impact how we read the Bible.
Sure.
It should impact us emotionally, but emotionalism would say something along the lines of, I read this passage and I didn't feel good about it, so I don't like it.
Right.
Or I come to a church and maybe it's too high church for me,
Sure.
Meaning liturgy, things like that. And, I do remember, early on, it's funny, it's hilarious to me that people leave Google reviews and like Yelp reviews for churches. Go read ours, they're hilarious. We have lots of great ones on there. But, somebody's like, how come nobody in that church has their hands raised and clearly the Spirit of God is not there? And I was like, well, you don't even know what was happening in that moment. It's a still picture. And, like we raise our hands, the whole church, when we sing the doxology at the end of our service. But, the point is that like, that's kind of an emotionalism driven understanding of it, that you're going to be a certain level of expressive and you're going to feel something. And I think the real danger for pastors, and just kind of letting listeners know this, is in a way, actually in seminary, a lot of times you're actually trained as a pastor. I was lucky. I think I had a homiletics professor who did not do this.
Right.
But I've heard of men who have had this, who kind of teach this idea of how to manipulate emotions of people to get them to feel and cry and do these kinds of things. And the pastorate, the worship leader, whoever it might be, should not be manipulating people's emotions.
Right.
I think that's the real danger we're dealing with here when we talk about these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I would even say we need to reframe it from manipulative to guide. We need to guide people's emotions biblically, liturgically. And there's another word that we could use for emotions, a word that kind of the ancients used and commentaries used, called passions. And the Bible talks a lot about passions. And so when we're guided by our emotions, oftentimes this emotionalism is being driven by our passions. What is it? Not so much you desire, but what's the reaction that you have to a certain situation.
Yeah.
And those reactions are sometimes God-given. Whether it's danger that you're facing, there's going to be adrenaline, these kind of things. People talk about the flight or fight response. But as Christians, we should want our passions to not be governing, like you said, the truth, and should not be governing our relationship with Christ. We should be passionate about Christ, passionate about the gospel. Our passions should be biblically informed. And I think a healthy liturgy will help shape those emotions. So if you come in sad, angry, you didn't sleep, happy, joyful, whatever it is, we can all worship the risen Lord, and our passions can be matured. Because as young people, as little children, we're often very passionate people. We have interest in things. We are often our passions deceive us. We think our parents are against us and they're not. Or we think our parents are great and maybe they weren't perfect. And so my point is that our passions will also often be used as a means of evaluation.
Yeah.
When I don't know if that's the most helpful way to think of our passions.
Yeah, think about your children.
Right.
I wrote this down because I thought it was a great quote from an English reformer named John Bradford. He said, "Faith must first go before, and then feeling will follow." And so I think what he's getting at there, and just to quote another guy from more memory, Spurgeon, I think, actually nailed it, and I don't want to butcher it, but essentially what he talks about is this idea of a carriage going down the road when it's dry, is that we might, like, if we mistook that the purpose of the carriage going down the road was to bring up dust when it's dry, we could go out with a broom and just mix up a bunch of dust, and then we're aiming at making dust, but we become a great annoyance by doing that. The purpose of the carriage is to get somewhere. And so it's kind of focusing on what are we after in a worship service. It's a love of God and a love of our neighbors, secondly to that, right? Like that's kind of what we're after is developing our affections for God, and then out of that comes things like emotions and things like that. I remember very distinctly during COVID at the very beginning when, all the churches closed down, and we did too. We were kicked out of a middle school, and, we didn't know what to do, and we were trying to find a place to meet. We eventually met in a parking lot pretty quickly, and we don't need to get into that today, but I remember the first time we were back together and we were able to take communion together, come to the Lord's table together.
Yeah.
And my soul was just longing for it.
Yeah.
I think I wept that day when we had communion together as a body again.
Yeah.
And it was something my soul longed for.
Right.
I was like, there was no it was funny because it was like parking lot worship kind of thing.
Sure.
There was no way we could conjure up this kind of thing.
Yeah.
To make people want to feel that. It was just like this, an overflow of gratitude for being with the body of Christ,
right?
What Christ has done, the goodness of God. And these are where our emotions in a service should flow from, not because the worship leader knew how to play the right chords.
Right, yeah. And I think with that, one of the things that comes up is how our emotions are shaped. We can actually shape our emotions. And I think that's a very interesting topic to discuss in our culture, because in our world, and we don't need to get too philosophical, but often the passions drive, and then we expect that our obedience, our duties before the Lord and in marriage and other places only should serve our passions. So if we don't feel like doing something, I shouldn't do it. That's inauthentic. Mm-hmm. This is where this gets really dangerous, because then people perceive obedience to the Lord only as authentic and true and holy if they can articulate or stir up the right emotional disposition to desire that obedience.
Yeah.
But what we know from people being people is that oftentimes duty informs passions and obedience. So if you want to love your wife more, it's not about conjuring up or reminiscing or trying to recreate certain situations that when you were dating or anything like that. It's about loving her dutifully and loving her biblically and showing her that kind of Christ-like love out of obedience first, and then that shapes your affections to be holy unto the Lord.
Yeah.
Of course, this is not to say when I see my wife, I'm glad instinctually. So there are instinctual kind of passions, but the what's often lost, I think, for many Christians is that the easiest example is I don't really feel like going to church.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go to church. If I were to go to church when I don't feel like going to church, that's inauthentic. And that's a real problem, because that's letting your passions drive you.
Yeah. What would you say? I'm curious, just so the listeners know, we haven't preset anything up.
Right.
This is literally a conversation. What would you say to a person, and I get it because I've been there, who's kind of man, the way this conference I went to or whatever, the music was powerful, the teaching was motivated me. And I was just I was in tears the whole time, and I don't get that from my home church, whether it's our church or any other church. Mm-hmm. What would you say to that person about that kind of experience and then bring that home, or another church experience that
Sure.
might have that, what would you say to that person?
Yeah, I would just say I'm glad you had that experience. That's wonderful that the Lord met you in that way during that time, a unique time. And I'm not going to put a lot of stock into evaluating, because I don't know what was taught. I don't know if it was good, because people are easily, like you said, manipulated. I think I've wrestled with this for a long time because, and I would share this with the person, I grew up in Christian kind of culture where, we'd go to summer camp or we'd go to youth camp or these other retreats, and there'd be this famous band that comes in. And if you're a famous band, you typically have a certain way to access and understand how people relate to the music and get them riled up and get them excited. And so I constantly experienced this as a young person in high school, where I would go to summer camp and I would have this, like, what I perceived to be a mountaintop experience of spirituality. Like, this is peak Christianity. All we're doing is Jesus stuff all day. And by Jesus stuff, I mean, like, we're praying all the time, we're doing worship every night, all this kind of stuff. And so
I would love for you to write a book called Jesus Stuff.
Jesus stuff. I should do that. And then I would come back to school and normal routine, sports, all that kind of stuff. And I didn't have that same, like, passion. I still have the same intentions, desires when I honor the Lord, but I didn't have the same, like, emotional encounter.
For sure.
And in college, that really, like, kind of got me upside down. And, like, I didn't know what it meant, like, to relate to the Lord. Fast forward, 15 years after college, or even 10 years after college, now I have a job. I have kids, I have a wife, I have a home, I have a mortgage. And I called one of our mentors and I was like, hey, like, I don't cry like I used to, when I listen to these songs, or is something wrong with me? Because that's how I had conceived of that emotional experience. And so that's why I would just say, I'm glad you had that experience. Like, I'm not here to, I will help you evaluate if it was legitimate, because some people could have the same experience at, like, a Tyler Childers or a Creed concert.
Creed, yes, definitely.
And so you could go have these emotional experiences every weekend if you wanted to. But we don't use that to judge the legitimacy of the Spirit moving. This is what Edwards talked about in Religious Affections. It was much more dramatic then. But this is a lot of what he was writing about then. Yeah,
because Edwards, like, just kind of piggybacking off of that, what he was pursuing when he wrote Religious Affections was explaining and trying to kind of guide people in a revival that was happening, and that it wasn't necessarily the emotional thing that was driving it. It was the Spirit of God, and he was trying to be instructive for people that ultimately it's rooted in the Word of God. And if we're not there, then we've got a big problem, right? And so I think you have to, I remember reading Religious Affections and going, like, and actually taking that out of context a little bit, and kind of messing that up. And, you see it. And so, I would say as well, like, with those mountaintop experiences, I think when I think to the other side of the coin, right, we can have services and a form of Christianity that almost feels emotionless. And we should be avoiding that. Equally. Right? Like, there should be no point in, I wrote it down because I love Spurgeon, right? But he said religion without emotion is religion without life. And he even talks about the saving of the sinner is that they must feel their sin, the weight and the gravity of it. And so I think there's a danger where we can run to the other side so hard that if I emote anything, it's bad.
You'll hear the old adage, the frozen chosen. The people who gather with no emotion whatsoever. Or you'll preach to people who are just kind of stare at you, and you're like, are you here? Or what do you seem angry? Maybe that's just your disposition, whatever. But I agree with you. There can be a danger here, and the danger, of course, is what we're talking about, which is either avoiding passions or emotions or anything like that because you just anathematize them. You think they're useless. When God made you a relational creature who has emotions, and we have to deal with that, we're limited. So I do think there's a danger. What if I would say, of course, in the American context, what we see more often is not so much that. Maybe in more high church traditions like Catholicism or or Anglicanism or something like that. But I really sense a lot of people like and where it comes home is mainly the music.
Yeah.
This is where it comes home. And that's why a lot of worship pastors feel so much pressure.
Yeah.
I mean, I led worship. I don't know did you lead worship when you were in college or anything?
I played guitar like 2 times.
Okay.
They would never give me a microphone.
The goal, the hope was that like people would emotionally connect.
Yeah.
Because in that emotional connection, you think this is how the Spirit moves. And so you'll see extreme versions of this with revivalism off the rails, but you'll see just kind of normal megachurch Christianity where there's certain tactics they'll use. I remember talking with one pastor one time where, in part of the network we used to be part of, it was very much like...
It shall not be named.
Darken the room, make the bass really heavy, and make sure the guys can't hear themselves sing, and then they will sing. And to whatever degree that's true or false, I'm not here to dispute that. I'm more interested in like, how does that shape you? Like, it kind of plays into that. Like, the best thing that can happen at church is for you to have this kind of like raw experience. And so, there's, like you said, there is a temptation where it's just rote duty.
Yeah,
we just do what we do, even if you don't feel like it. That can be a temptation. But if I were to diagnose where we are in American spirituality, I don't perceive that to be the primary error that we're wading into.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's not there. And, I think you're right on in talking about music and how we sing. Our staff just read a book about that. We were trying to just learn together and understand that. But it's funny because if somebody were to ask me, I think it's funny. Maybe I'm considered older now because I'm in my 40s, or whatever that means. But I remember the first time I was moved by kind of what I perceived to be the awe, like of God, was actually in my grandmother's very old Presbyterian church, and it was on an Easter Sunday, and the choir would come down the aisle, and they would sing, and it was just this beautiful choir. There was organ, choir, and they just walked down and just like to sing. And I remember thinking to myself, there's something here, and so I don't want people to hear us saying that there's not something to be discovered in that kind of emotional response. If I think back now, being honest, I think that actually that experience kind of set me on a bit of a trajectory for going, what was that? Yeah,
right. You chase it.
Yeah, you chase it. And I was like, I was moved as I was probably 8 years old.
Right.
And just like hearing that and just like all those voices together and hearing the congregation sing with them.
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, what was that?
For sure.
Like I sensed a power there. I realized that this is big. And so I'd also encourage people to understand that can happen from very simple forms.
Correct. Yeah. And I think what I'm seeing is, and I saw this in college. I was a Christian in college, so I saw this with Bible studies and all that kind of stuff. Younger Christians seem to value congregational singing in a way that maybe our age didn't or doesn't even.
Yeah.
To where we're used to kind of the concert, contemporary music, and most of the contemporary music that we consider contemporary, they consider like boomer music now.
Yeah.
Where they're like, oh yeah, this is like Gen X millennial stuff. And like what I remember from college is like when Christians would just get around and sing songs, Christian songs with a guitar. That's a very powerful experience. Yeah. It can be. Now, I want to pinpoint something in this thread we're pulling with the songs we sing. I think the doctrinal clarity and the accuracy of the songs we sing very much impacts our emotions. And much of the contemporary music industry is very much about kind of like me being the center. Of course, the best ones are the ones that talk about God's greatness and His sovereignty and salvation and all that. But oftentimes the music we sing is very me-focused. When we come to church, we're not me-focused. We're about God. We're about serving one another and that kind of thing. And so even in that kind of, if let's say we had a college worship night, and it was just kind of like a guy with a guitar leading, and we all sing a cappella with the guitar, then I would hope those songs would be theologically, true. Like, we don't want to sing things that are untrue. I found myself in churches, not this summer, but other times, where I'm not going to sing along because these words seem not to be as accurate as they should
Yeah.
be in terms of like theological clarity.
Yeah. I think it's important too, just because we make this podcast for our church
Yeah.
predominantly. And I think one of the things that we always said, we've clearly, if you've been at the well for a while, you understand that we've changed in many ways on how we go about things. But I think something that's been true from the very beginning is that our stance, like people go, how do you pick songs, is kind of lyrically, we've always said we would never sing a song we wouldn't preach.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like our baseline for operating. And I think that gets into preaching and all of those kinds of things. And so I'm curious, I know we're going a little bit long, but I would love to discuss a little bit. What do you think of emotion and preaching? So when we get into that topic, so we've kind of talked about music quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I think that's a natural thing, because if any listeners are wondering, all I have to do is play like M83 outro and Chase is going to cry.
It's going to be awesome.
It's going to be awesome, right? If you don't know that song, you should go look it up. It's great.
Or the Dune soundtrack or The Last Mohicans. Yeah.
And for me, it's basically any Lana Del Rey.
Okay, great. Excellent. Matt.
People are going to be like, what?
Okay, Ron, what was the question?
So preaching,
Yeah.
How should preaching
Yeah.
touch on emotions?
Yeah. So, because we've had a lot of this feedback. I think it was you back in the day, because we write out,
gosh, I know
you
what
have
you're
your
saying.
notes, right?
Yeah.
And I have my manuscript. And somebody came up to you before the service and threw your notes in the trash because you're not being spirit led, right?
Yeah.
If you have notes.
That did happen.
That was a funny teaching moment. But with preaching, the Puritans were very big on this. It was part of the Reformation in England specifically, but also the Reformation generally, was that our preaching should impact people's emotions. And Spurgeon is big on this too.
Yeah.
Like how should our preaching impact people's emotions? How should we, I think it's disorienting for people today, but I sympathize with the Puritans on this, is that they actually sought to terrorize people with their preaching.
Yeah.
So their preaching was mainly to stir up a fear of the Lord and fear of hell, so that people would come to a saving knowledge of Jesus.
It's a great church growth model.
Yeah, no, I mean, and their churches did grow.
Yeah,
They were
did.
like back in their day, like sermons were like one of the things you did. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I got to go listen to some sermons. I really like. You would watch football. Like
Yeah.
the Bengals are on tonight.
6:15.
Yeah, and they would be like, oh, Spurgeon's on tonight, or like, not that Spurgeon was a Puritan, but you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I got you.
So yeah, I think that preaching should impact emotions. I think there should be an emotional component. The preacher should believe truly what he's preaching, authentically, if we want to say that. And then he should communicate it clearly in a way that is compelling. If I were to get up there, and I've joked about doing it, but I'm not going to do it,
Yeah.
is if I were to get up there and just read, which is actually what Edwards did.
Yeah.
Edwards would manuscript and simply read his sermon. Now, I don't know about his intonation. I don't know about his pitch and all that kind of stuff, but he was just reading. And people were like, at that point, they were flopping on the floor and saying, this is Holy Spirit revival. And that's why he wrote Religious Affections. There's a lot of things going on that he couldn't explain. He was trying to explain it. But I do think good biblical preaching should impact people's passions and emotions. But oftentimes, we have to remember we're easily manipulated.
Yeah.
We're malleable, we're formable, we can change. And so we have to be very careful when we hear either popular preacher out there or a podcast or whatever it may be, a talk, and we go, man, that's so true, because it simply got us. And I think, honestly, you're probably better crafted at that than I am. I think you have some fun stories from seminary about doing that. I'm interested in that as a skill, but not so much like a lot of preachers make it their craft.
Yeah.
Like that's what they do.
No, I would warn people on manipulation.
Yeah.
And it's not a good thing.
Right.
It's not a good thing to be emotionally manipulated into feeling something. And the reason I would say that is because it's not deep. It's what would cause somebody potentially even to think that they've become a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And when they're truly not regenerate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big problem. And I hear a lot of knocking on nominalism, and that's not the point of today. But I think nominalism a lot of times comes out of this idea of like, man, I was emotionally stirred, I must be a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Or like we have a baptism service where it's like the preacher preaches this riveting kind of like thing that draws me in.
Right.
And now I have to get baptized right now.
Right.
Like this moment.
Right.
Because that's an emotional draw.
And that can be true. Like
can be, absolutely.
We're not discounting the reality of that happening, but we are saying what we see as the error most predominantly is this very revivalistic kind of strain where it's like we're doing a baptism service. And I mean, you did really well early on at trying to really get this dialed in terms of like, how do we prevent people from just responding emotionally? I mean, you've always been very sensitive to the fact that people are steered and driven by emotions in a way that maybe they shouldn't be. And so how do we set up procedures for evaluating if they're truly Christian? Whereas a lot of churches wouldn't do that. A lot of churches would be like, you want to get baptized? You believe in Jesus? Great. Let's dunk you.
Yeah.
And
Presbyterians.
Yeah, sure. Definitely not Presbyterians.
They'll baptize anybody, I heard.
Yeah, sure. But yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, we could keep going, but the emotional manipulation, I think I agree with you, but I do want to, I wish there was more precision there because people are, let's say we want to avoid the word manipulation.
Okay.
People are shaped, and it would be easy to take any shaping as manipulation. So if I watch a movie or I listen to a song or I interact with a really captivating, charismatic person, that's not always manipulation. Now, in our propagandist age, a lot of it is.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of manipulation out there. But just because we're trying to create a certain atmosphere in the room, or we're trying to get people to a point of repentance and preaching the law and the gospel and understanding the gospel, that's not necessarily manipulation.
No.
But I think I think it's easy in our day to say everything is manipulation.
Yeah, we're naturally skeptical.
We're naturally skeptical people, cynical people. And so I want to make sure we don't discount the realities of human interaction. Like if I were to get up there, and some people may perceive me this way, if I were to get up there and preach with a scowl on my face, which
I've never done that.
which I don't think is.
I don't think you have, actually.
Okay, great.
I've seen you smile at least once in every sermon.
And then I were to preach about the joy of the Lord.
Yeah.
That would be weird.
That would be weird.
So your emotions should match the text that you're preaching, and your emotions as a preacher should compel people to want to. And that's the tricky thing with that word manipulation is we do want people to want God more.
Yeah.
And we should use whatever's biblically permissible to help people want God more. But if we take that principle to the wrong place, I mean, it's just run amok in evangelicalism, where we've got this revivalistic culture that if I didn't feel something's wrong with me, or something's wrong with the preacher, the worship leader, or the pastor, or the church. And so, I just wanted to make sure we caveated that, because that word manipulation can easily get misapplied. When we're not being manipulated, we're just being shaped and formed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to make, because when people are being formed, their emotions should be tied to that.
Yeah.
They should have a response to that.
Just like you want your son to watch the Bengals and love it. I want my son to watch Texas A&M football and love it, or hate it after this last weekend.
Both of us have chosen very hard teams to achieve that. This is why they're great disciples of Jesus. It's very difficult.
They learn suffer from an early age.
So pick a terrible team, make your family watch them, and go, we will continue to worship this team.
Oh my gosh.
No, I know. Gospel Coalition already wrote an article on that. Telling us about how we worship everything.
Oh my gosh.
And so
that's amazing.
I'm sorry, we digress.
You're fine.
But I like coming back to it. I do think it's important to think through that. And I've become convinced that actually age has a thing to play in this, where it's like, I can actually, as I get older, I'm realizing I can receive things that impact me deeply, and I'm not overly emotive about those things as I once was. I don't know what that is. I'm not saying I'm an expert on that.
Sure.
But I think we change over time.
Yeah.
And looking at it's one of the things I love about our church is it's funny. I always joke with people we're the most Presbyterian Baptist church you've ever been to.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it's like you get a mix of people who come from like the frozen chosen world and actually a little bit of the charismatic world.
Right.
And you kind of put them in a room together.
Yeah, it gets wild.
Yeah, and people can feel like, am I doing it wrong? How are these things going? And I think like, hey, God has made us uniquely and differently and how we respond to things. And I've learned over, 18, 19 years now of ministry, that like there's something there in each one of these. And it's not necessarily, it sounds wimpy to say it's not right or wrong.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of respecting where somebody's at and
Yep.
how they're emoting that, what's going on in life.
Yep.
I think about it in our church when we've had, something big going on or somebody's sick or something, and you're preaching and it happens to tap on that.
Yep.
Man, like there's nothing wrong with getting emotive in that moment.
Right.
We always tease Derek because he's our crier on staff
He is.
as far as preachers.
Maybe because we don't let him preach enough. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
that's what it is. It used to be me,
Yeah.
and people have told me like, you don't seem to get as emotive as you once were. And I was like, I think it's just, I'm in a different phase of life.
Yeah, maybe
right
get
now.
your T levels checked. Maybe even,
They're fine,
or
Chase.
maybe you get more soy and you can cry more. I don't know.
You know what? I'm ready to end this podcast and fight Chase.
But even riffing on that is
Yeah.
like, even our biology plays into it. My
Yeah.
point, I'm joking about this stuff, but even our,
my T levels are fine.
it's great. Excellent, man.
I had them checked.
I'm so happy for you. The biological makeup of men and women are different.
Yeah.
And the way they experience emotions, particularly women,
Yeah.
is going to be unique. And so, like, pinning our relationship to Christ, relationship to his body on that emotional state can be fairly dangerous. Now, of course, for men, the danger is, being a bit too stoic, not wanting to raise our hands, not using the duty to inform our emotions. But I think that's a predominant way that people play out differently. And we do want to respect it, but we also want to disciple people into a biblical understanding.
Yeah. Here's what I'd say, kind of my parting shot in all
Okay.
of this, is I would encourage people to think, what are we aiming at in our worship of God? Is it to have a feeling which can betray us? Or can be good? I can give all that, right? Or is it true and right worship of God? And so it's a beautiful thing. One of the things I love is our church has switched to a more liturgical format, is that there's days, and I think some people don't even know this, there's days that I show up on a Sunday, I have to preach a sermon, I get to preach a sermon, and it's been a hard week or whatever, and I'm just tired, kind of done, maybe I didn't sleep well, whatever it might be. And I'm just not feeling it, as they say.
Sure.
I don't get to just go, I'm just going to mail it in.
Right.
There's a duty that is in there.
Not just because you get paid, because you want to honor the Lord.
Yeah, because like honestly, like I've never once thought like, oh, I'm doing this for the money.
Yeah, right.
I've never once.
We wouldn't have moved here to plant a church if that.
Yeah, we would have done that in Oklahoma.
I know, right?
I think the only completely red state in the election, right?
Yeah.
Like that's where you would have gone if you wanted to do that. Housing costs, all that kind of stuff. Anyways, but there's a moment where you have to go like, I almost every Sunday for me, I'm standing there, I'm getting ready to get up and preach a sermon and go before God and the people of God. And I have to have this moment where I just go, Lord, it doesn't matter what I'm feeling right now. Help me preach your word rightly.
Yep.
May people be saved. May the saints be encouraged and love you more.
Yep.
That's pretty much what I pray every Sunday.
Yep.
And I think there's something for the body to go, I'm not feeling it right now.
Right.
That's fine. I don't have to fake the expression.
Right.
But I get to say this creed.
Yep.
I get to sing this song. I get to sit under your word. I get to take communion.
Right.
I get to do these things, and that's enough. I think that that's a great place to be for some people.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think the funny thing with the sermons, oftentimes the feedback you get, particularly with your sermons, is that the days you feel like, I didn't do well, or it was a mess, or I wasn't really into it, people respond positively.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the salvation of souls isn't up to us. It's up to God. And this is what Finney in the Second Great Awakening got wrong, is he thought he could manipulate people into to repenting of their sins and becoming a new creation in Christ. And so I think it's just a testimony to God's salvation, that it's ultimately not about conjuring a certain atmosphere in the room, whether you're like Bethel, which is, I think it's fair to say, heretical, regarding like how they have gold dust and all this kind of stuff. That's the peak, that's like peak emotionalism. Or whether it's like you had an experience with the Catholic Church with the choir. We should be guarded, we should be discerning, we should be responsible, and we should discern the truth of God rightly and be, as the Bible says, good Bereans, and show up to church eager to worship the Lord.
Yeah.
And if we don't feel like we're eager to worship the Lord, then I think that's okay. You can still eagerly worship the Lord in the way we express ourselves and the way we behave. But yeah, we could keep going on this.
Yeah.
But anything
Yeah.
else from you?
Just say, the goal is not to pursue our feelings, but it's to pursue the Lord,
Yeah.
which you already said. And so that's what we're after.
Yep.
And I think that's very freeing for people.
I hope so. Yeah, I want it to be, because it frees them from kind of a cycle,
Yeah.
right? Of like just highs and lows and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think that's a good word to close out on. Well, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Just Say It. Give it a like, subscribe. I think we're on YouTube, so you can, I think they say hit the notification bell.
Smash that.
Smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Share this episode with a friend, whether at church or outside our church, who you think this might be helpful with. I hope this was helpful for you. You can always contact us at boulderwell.org. And if you do want to support our ministry, boulderwell.org/give. I could have literally made that into a Rogan episode of 3 hours.